Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm speaking a little bit off the viral topic today. I'm going to start with this slide, and I'm going to start with it because most of you are going to hear about pandemics today and, black swan events, which are rare and unexpected. I think those are a lot like tsunamis. They're big, they're huge, they come and hit you, but then they fade away. I think what we're going to talk about is more like rising oceans related to climate change. I know we shouldn't mention climate change in Florida. I think that's verboten, but essentially look what happens to Florida with the slow rise of the seas with climate change. Either way, though, you're going under, right? So once upon a time, 1928 to be exact, there was a great scientist, and by the way, for those of you who tell your children these stories, you can just cross off scientist and say hero. So a great hero named Fleming discovered the miracle of antibiotics. And that was around 1928, actually. And thereafter, you know that we hit this period where we were in the golden age of antibiotics. We had penicillins and aminoglycosides and tetracyclines and this, that, and the other thing. And that golden age has persisted right through to the last couple of decades. But Fleming was quite prescient. He actually said something that was very interesting. He said that microbes can be educated to resist penicillin, and a host of penicillin-fast organisms is bred out. In such cases, the thoughtless person playing with penicillin is morally responsible for the death of the man who finally succumbs to infection with a penicillin-resistant organism. I hope this evil can be averted. So he knew what was coming. And in fact, if you look at the sequence of events as it relates to antimicrobials over the 20th century, it has always been one of introduce the drug, resistance develops. And that's held pretty much right through. If you look at the last two, daptomycin introduced in 2003, resistance in 2004. Ceftaz-avibactam released 2015. Same year, you've got resistant pathogens coming up. So we have a real substantial resistance problem. And it's along the lines of what Dr. Buckman said. A lot of it's driven by travel, in fact, at least the dissemination of it. Now, when we talk about multi-drug resistance, it's worth kind of just defining the term. Basically, a multi-drug resistant organism is one that's non-susceptible to at least one agent of the three major antimicrobial categories, whereas a pan-drug resistant strain is resistant to all known antimicrobials. And of course, an extensively drug-resistant one is intermediate to that. So we all know what the problem is as far as how you drive resistance, right? My wife's an allergist, and I keep telling her, what are you doing with all these antibiotics? Because people come in and they go, I got the sniffles or whatever, or I got a wheeze. They all want antibiotics. So getting to this issue, it's actually very precise in terms of how these resistances developed. Like if you look at gram-negative pathogens, it's not well known, but in fact, penicillin, when it was introduced, most gram-negatives were susceptible to it. In fact, Staph aureus was susceptible to it. In my career, I've only ever seen one Staph aureus specimen that was still susceptible to penicillin. It was a guy who had chronic osteo from the Second World War. He actually got his Staph aureus infection before penicillin was widespread. But once it was introduced in the night, we found resistance developed quite quickly. So you had susceptible gram-negatives becoming resistant. You introduced ampicillin and aminopenicillins. Next thing you know, you've got resistant E. coli developing through a bunch of different mechanisms. You add cephalosporins and fluoroquinolones in the 1980s and 90s. You start getting resistance there. And then in the 2000s, we have carbapenems being introduced. Lo and behold, a couple of years later, you have NDM, you have porin defects, you have metallo-beta-lactamases, you have resistance again. Now, what drives this resistance? As we said, it's use of antibiotics, but more than that, in fact, it's the total consumption of antibiotics. You can actually show this on a institutional level. This is an institutional study. So if you look at carbapenem resistance in this particular institution, you can see that the use of the carbapenem is closely followed by an increased incidence, increased selection of organisms that are resistant. And if you go out further here, you see that as the use falls, so too does the level of resistance in the hospital. And again here, increased use again, increased incidence of resistance, always following. You can apply that, by the way, to the individual. You can apply it on an institutional level. You can apply it on a national level. And in fact, you can apply it to a global level. This is a study by Collignon that was published, I believe, last 5 years ago. And you can see the countries that have the greatest use of antibiotics invariably have the highest level of resistance. Now, you can't show causality just with that, but there have been lots of studies that have been done that actually show causality between basically the tonnage of antibiotics distributed and the development of resistance or the selection of resistant strains. What's the problem with antimicrobial resistance? Well, primarily, it's not that getting the wrong drug initially kills you, it's that it delays getting the right drug. So if you look, for example, in this study, where you look at fluoroquinolone resistant strains and fluoroquinolone susceptible strains, you can see that only about 10% of people get appropriate antimicrobials within 24 hours if they're resistant, but more like 55% if they're sensitive. What's the impact of resistance on outcomes? How many lives do we save? How many times do we have to get it right to save one life? Basically, inappropriate antibiotics give you a 3.4 times risk of increase in risk of death. This is just kind of all comers. I did a study myself where we looked at in septic shock, and in that particular case, there was a 5-fold increase in mortality. You went from 10% mortality to 50% mortality, just if you gave the wrong antibiotic at the first dose, even if you corrected it thereafter. Basically, for every 5 patients given appropriate therapy, you'll get 1 more survivor. Where is the problem that we're seeing now? Well, if you look at ESBL-producing E. coli by country, this is in the first half of the decade, you can see that there are some places, India and Bolivia in particular, that have 80 to 100% resistance. 80 to 100%. United States, on the other hand, tend to 20% ballpark, but whether it's going up or down, I'll show you, but certainly it's progressing here. What about carbapenemase-resistant Klebsiella pneumonia, a KPC we call them? Where is that? These are even more difficult to treat because you don't have carbapenems to treat it. And again, hotspots, India, Guatemala, Nicaragua, well, these two in the west, Greece in the eastern side, Greece and India in particular. So again, we're seeing there 50 to 60% incidence of carbapenemase resistance there. And if you think that's bad enough, we're actually seeing plasmid-mediated colistin resistance. So if you start seeing plasmid-mediated colistin resistance, you're getting to pan-resistant strains of various gram-negatives, and those are just starting to be seen. The CDC and the World Health Organization have actually defined what are urgent threats and what are serious threats and those that are of less magnitude. But the urgent threats, basically carbapenem-resistant Acinetobacter, Candida auris, which is a new Candida species, at least recognized clinically in just in the last 5 years. Clostridioides difficile, used to be called Clostridium difficile, and carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae, CRE. Now, there are other threats. The ones that are underlined are the ones that are particularly relevant to intensivists. You guys are familiar with a lot of those, so I'm not going to belabor it, but I will go through a couple of them and just show you what's going on with them. So this is carbapenem-resistant Acinetobacter. This is US data. You can see in terms of the resistance level, it's actually falling across all the different groups of antimicrobials. So 98% to 89%, 80% to 75%. So that's good news there. The percent of Acinetobacter that are resistant is falling, and the number of cases of Acinetobacter is falling as well. So that's one of those good news stories. On the other hand, carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae, those are relatively stable, maybe increasing a little bit. ESBL-producing Enterobacteriaceae clearly increasing over the last 5 years, so that's bad news. Drug-resistant hospitalized Candida infections, generally those are actually going down. Now, those are the Candida Candida, the usual Candida, Candida albicans, Candida glabrata, Candida parasilosis, etc. I'm not talking about Candida auris there. Most of these cases are albicans and glabrata, as I mentioned. Those are actually showing the increased resistance but decreasing frequency. So good news, bad news. And in this particular case, what's mostly happening is that we're selecting out the variants that are resistant. So for example, Candida glabrata is increasing in frequency relative to Candida albicans because it tends to be more resistant to the azoles, which we commonly use. Candida auris is another Candida species that has come to our clinical attention in the last 4 or 5 years. We're seeing scattered cases across the United States, increasing quite rapidly. Problem with this is that it is completely resistant to virtually all the known antifungals, all the ones that are clinically available. This was interesting. Unlike KPC and, for example, ESBL, which developed in certain places and then spread. So, for example, the Carbapenem-Resistant New Delhi beta-lactamase, that obviously came from India. I think the KPCs, which is another variant of that, came from Israel. And then rapid travel around the world, air travel, as Dr. Buckman was discussing, basically disseminated that through the rest of the world. How much of a problem is antimicrobial resistance? It's really interesting if you look at it from an economics point of view. Now, we're physicians, so we don't really look at economics that much. But I will say when you look at the numbers, it's quite startling. This is the impact on GDP globally during the 2008 financial collapse. So it basically dropped the GDP by about 4% or so, plus minus. Now, a low AMR scenario, a low antimicrobial resistance scenario, you get about 1%. But in a high AMR scenario, you're talking about 4.5%, 5%, 6%. And the really interesting thing there is we're talking about $100 trillion US dollars by 1950. We're talking about, at that point, $10 trillion per year. So you're going to take $10 trillion out of the economy that you might be using for other things, including healthcare, if we don't get this resistance problem under control. What about deaths, though? We are most interested in deaths. Right now, AMR accounts for about 700,000 deaths globally. By 2050, it's estimated to be about 10 million deaths. Comparatively to cancer, it'll actually be more of a cause of death than cancer, which would be projected to be about 8 million or so. And you can see the other conditions across here. Where are those deaths going to occur? Well, we've got pretty advanced medical systems in the United States, Canada, most of Western Europe. So we're going to see maybe 300,000 plus minus deaths per year. But on the other hand, Asia and Africa, approximately 4 million deaths per year from AMR by 2050. Now, you might be asking, well, you know what? We've controlled this problem with antibiotics, and we're still seeing new antibiotics every year. What's the problem? We can just give antibiotics. Well, in fact, if you look kind of at the surface, we're doing pretty well in terms of this issue. You can see just in the last decade, there's at least 8, if not 10 now, 12 antibiotics that have been produced and licensed and are available in some place in the advanced world, United States or Europe. The problem is that there have been no novel antibiotics in the last 30 years or so. The last antibiotic that was, well, maybe with the exception of fidaxomicin. Fidaxomicin might be the only new antimicrobial, and it's not a big one in terms of its utility, might be the only new antimicrobial that's been developed in the last 30 years. When I mean new, I mean novel. Something that has no cross resistance to anything else. Basically entirely separate mechanism. You can see that the peak was in the 1950s, going down by the 1980s down to 2 novel groups, and then basically flat since then. Now, if we're going to contain antimicrobial resistance, how are we going to do it? Well, I mean, frankly, we could have talks going for hours on how you do it, but basically you have to have interventions on the human and animal level both, and then you have to look at antimicrobial drug utilization. But all of these are kind of external to what we do. So I'm going to just say that they exist. There's lots of things, some of the containment that Dr. Buckman was talking about actually also applies here. But we have control of something else. We have control of the antimicrobials and what's going on in the hospital. So what's critical is you got to use the drugs that you have right. You want to use the correct drug at the right time, first off, so selection is important. It's really important for us in particular that we want to dose appropriately to the circumstances. The big one that we tend to get wrong is we tend to underdose because the volume of distribution in critically ill people can be up by a substantial factor. Normal human body, 100 kilo person, has about 20 liters of volume, extracellular volume. How difficult is it to increase that? So when you give somebody saline, for example, basically you often give them 10 liters of saline, 5 liters of saline. So you can increase the extracellular space by a factor of about 50% quite easily. And if you give standard doses, you can substantially underdose. That's something you have to worry about. You have to be careful about timing. If you give the antimicrobial too early, you may be treating unnecessarily because you don't actually have the diagnosis you were worried about. On the flip side, you treat too late, what happens is if they survive, that they have a prolonged hospital and ICU course, and I guarantee you they get lots of antimicrobials during that course. And then you want to use the best dosing strategy available. So for example, PK optimization, in particular, beta-lactams, the new surviving sepsis, is probably going to say extended infusion is a better way to use them, but there are all sorts of things along those lines that you can improve. Again, another talk. Stewardship, incredibly important. Won't get into the details here, but I can tell you that virtually every study that's looked at the importance of stewardship programs actually shows a benefit in terms of reducing the amount of resistance in the hospital situation. And in fact, somebody asked me once, well, isn't that shutting the barn door after the horses have bolted? Some of the horses are still in the barn, so it's still useful. And then we have some interesting novel non-antimicrobial approaches to the AMR problems. Vaccines, you have both direct and indirect protection. Indirect protection, you inoculate for influenza, and you have decreased risk of MRSA pneumonia. Antibody therapy is being developed for things like C. diff and bacterial pneumonia. Bacteriophages are a novel approach to kill bacterial pathogens. Fecal microbial transplants, basically stool transplant, seems to be very effective for some things, and replacing your flora with probiotics and such is another potential approach. Antibacterial and immune response augmenting peptides and antivirulence factor products. Do I have a couple of minutes? Okay, so I'm just to the last couple of slides. So these are the antibiotics that have been authorized in the last 2 years. And there's a decent number of them. 2 of them, in fact, are novel agents, entirely novel agents. This one, the beta-lactamase inhibitor is a boronate. This one, lefloxamilin. This is a group that's entirely novel. Although this one was actually developed in the 1950s, it's now turned into a clinical product. So 8 new products. The problem is most of these drugs are being developed by small biopharma. And just in the last year, 2 of them, Melinta and Achaogen, they went bankrupt. This was picked up, though, fortunately, by Cipla, this product. And then this one here, this company, Tetraphase, has been cutting back. They're under some financial stress. So the small companies that actually develop these products, not doing that well. So not all of these, although they're approved, not all of them may be produced. Fortunately, there are more drugs in the pipeline, 32 antibiotics in the pipeline. Again, there is a problem with that. At least half of them are just a beta-lactam, beta-lactamase inhibitor combination. It's just a variant of stuff that we already have, and that can be a significant issue. There's about 250 or so products that are in preclinical development that may be useful. I'm going to just focus on the biological antibacterials in development. These are actually quite cool. There's a bunch of them. Like I said, an anti-Staph aureus immunoglobulin, phage endolysin, basically a phage product, et cetera. You can see all these very novel kind of drugs that are being developed, and hopefully some of them will come to fruition. And I did mention vaccines before. You know, if the 50s, 60s, and 70s was the golden age for antibiotics, right now is the golden age for vaccines. We have more vaccines being produced now than we ever had before, and we are actually developing vaccines for gram-negative sepsis, potentially for Staph aureus, and for a variety of other pathogens. So the question at the beginning was, are we winning the battle but losing the war? And here's my thoughts on this. I think that if this is a battle, then I think we in this room, physicians, healthcare workers, can actually potentially win that battle with help, a little bit of help. But if it's a war, well, a war you need government support. And I think right now that's lacking a bit. There was one nice act that kind of spurred some antimicrobial development and discovery and development. That was the GAIN Act. Most recently, the Disarm Act has been introduced but not advanced, and this would reimburse hospitals via Medicaid for novel and critically important antimicrobials. That could be a really important thing. It's really interesting to me. We'll spend $100,000 for an obscure anti-cancer drug that is a limited application, which has borderline 8% improvement in survival, for example. But when we're talking about antibiotics, which will give you a 50 or 60% improvement in survival, we bulk at a cost of anything more than $1,000, $2,000, right? So, and that gives you, like I said, 60% improvement in survival probability. So my last thought is, AMR is coming. It is a big problem, but it's only one problem. So, thank you.